doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
So I turn to you, Mark, and one of the first things I'd like you to address is, should we be disinterested in learning from some of the existing models that Europe and North Africa and elsewhere in the OECD markets have experienced? So I'd like your recommendations and views on how we can take very practical steps to leapfrog some of the OECD type models to date, and get your view on whether you believe that we could emerge as one of the global leaders in RegTech or trade tech. And then finally, I'd like you to just share your views on the top 5 incentives and policies that you'd recommend be put in place to spur RegTech innovation and development across the continent's $3.2 trillion African continental free trade area opportunity. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Hubert. I'm going to be honest with you. To answer your questions probably take a better man than me, but I'll certainly share my experience of somebody who is an entrepreneur within the tech space and having to address some of the fundamental issues that we found. So I mean, sort of picking up both on Alistair and on Devraj, is that innovation itself, and what you're talking about, is an incredible innovative journey. It's actually quite fragile. And I think there's a sense that, back to your point, the advantages and disadvantages is that I really feel that Africa in itself, yes, is good to look to other regions within Europe and in the US, but actually it's a journey that you need to take ownership of yourself. Because when I think about just what you've described and what's been talked about over the last 10 or 15 minutes, is that actually there's a huge amount of work to be done. And how are we going to resource that and drive that forward in a way that at a pace that you want to achieve? So what COVID has done is accelerate where people are talking about 6 years of digitization being done in 3 or 4 months, to move things forward. And I think Africa as a nation and the continent has got some really interesting demographics. And that's where, you basically have the world's 10 youngest populations. And so if you go down a traditional route of development, which Silicon Valley or even the big companies, and I've nothing against them, companies like IBMs of the world would push you, is you basically need a huge amount of development capacity to actually be able to drive that journey. And I think that capacity to transform in a traditional way is something that you really need to actually be challenging. And this is where, I guess, as somebody who's struggling in this space myself, is that we've really focused on this whole rise of no-code, low-code type technologies. And as Devraj said, is that a lot of these technologies are actually coming out themselves out of startup incubators, innovation. And it's how do we harness that and make a kind of almost a commitment that technology-wise we're actually going to take a route of democratizing this technology across the continent, rather than looking to 1 or 2 key, technical superpowers to actually provide that capacity, that journey. And I think, so that's one aspect, is actually acknowledging, and where we acknowledge basically the demographic, but also acknowledge that how are we going to actually harness and train. So back to Devraj's point, I guess the area that I'm focusing on personally is that whole secondary, almost before university. How do we start to create that pipeline of interested young people who want to actually come into this industry that we're going to need over the next decade? And through things like apprenticeship programs, startup apprenticeship, which is I'm literally in the middle of one just now. I think the other point I also think a lot about is the economics. So one of the things is that even in Scotland, the economics that work are not the same economics that work, for example, in the US, or even actually south of the border in London. We need to make sure that when we choose these solutions that we're actually looking at the cost. So it's very easy at one level, the cost per transaction, but we actually need to look at what does it cost to develop, what does it cost to maintain, and what does it cost to operate. So if I'm going to build something, it needs to be at a level that allows actually the small, medium enterprise to actually participate. And if that's something that actually we really, really struggle within, within Scotland as an example, to get companies that are, less than 20 million turnover, for example, to really look at the digitization of their administrative processes, etc. How do we actually, well, we need to drive not only just the development cost down, but we've also got to drive down the cost of software and the approach that we're taking. So I think just on your, so they're just, I guess they're the two things, I guess, when we talked about this, Hubert, that I kind of thought about, and I think it's actually something where it's really important, and this kind of moves on to the final point, is almost that ownership about how are people going to participate within the African continent, because there's a danger that if with big companies are going to bring big costs and big ideas, but actually we should also look to the innovation that is already on the ground and how can we actually harness that, and always keeping an eye on those people that are really driving towards that low code, no code approach to how they're deploying things. So the 5 things I really I'm absolutely passionate is about the education, and it's not just the university level and creating those innovation hubs, it's getting right back. And I'll tell you a very small story is my daughter, she wants to be a scientist now, but she made up her mind in primary 6. And I guess for me, that sticks in my mind that whatever we do from an education point of view, we actually need to think in decades, go right back and think about how are we actually going to capture the imagination of the next generation and pull them through so that, and some of those will want to go to university, some will want to go a different pathway, but as a ways of us actually capturing that imagination and starting to harness it into our economy, and particularly into the digital economy and the e-commerce economy as we go forward. The second thing is choose wisely, I think, about the approach that you take to development. So the kind of software, and there's lots of good stuff that's starting to reach a maturity point where I don't need to be a developer. I can actually be an experienced business user who can then harness that development to actually drive and advance and digitize what it is I'm actually trying to do. I think the third thing is around, we are looking at this in Scotland, is around how do we incentivize businesses that are they're beyond scale up, but to really grow, they need to spend and expand using a digital approach rather than continuing to purely invest human capital into it. How do we actually create some form of incentive or investment, not only in startups that are creating the new technologies, but also invest into companies that may then become the consumers of this technology? Because we need to recognize, again, the economics of that can be quite hard for those companies. And I think, picking up on Deborah's thing, is that the whole thing of the incubator, so as part of creating this trust is also creating an environment where we take the fragility of innovation and actually create incubators of ideas where there's focused themes around RegTech, digital economy, e-commerce, where there's funding, resourcing, skilling. We talked about reverse mentoring before, Hubert. At the minute, I've got a 19-year-old who works with me. He actually gives me so much energy because he's full of ideas, and that kind of harnessing of actually working in collaboration with the younger generation, I think, is really critical in that. And I think then the final point, which I've already touched upon, is really, I really feel a sense of grasp a hold of ownership. And I don't think this is something that, don't let US or Europe drive you. on the route, because I don't actually think their models are necessarily going to give you things that you want at the speed that you want, at the cost that you want. So, you know, that's my tuppence worth on it, Hubert, right? As somebody who's, you know, trying to function within this space myself and create a pipeline and put the resources in place so that as the good ideas come in, we actually have those people who are aligned and trained in the technologies that we need to actually accelerate and drive this forward. So thanks for that, Hubert.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.